Good afternoon. This presentation focuses on the potential impact of climate change on the ownership of game within the context of a fenced wildlife area. The purpose of this presentation is to highlight how climate change may pose a significant threat to fenced wildlife areas. I also intend to demonstrate how recommendations from conservation research need to have a legal grounding to ensure its value to conservation management. Finally, I intend to show you how legal systems need to keep pace with emerging challenges in order for us to conserve biodiversity effectively. And perhaps on the way, you may get some insights into the legalities of game ownership. As a quick summary, the impacts of climate change is most likely to cause vegetation change, reduction in the quality and quantity of habitat, displace both habitats and species, and so on. The end result is that these changes are likely to cause vulnerable wildlife to migrate to more suitable areas. Conceptually, what are the options available for a wildlife manager to mitigate the impacts of climate change? The first is adaptive management. This could include changing burning regimes, provision of water holes, or alter the density of game. The next option is assisted migration, by physically relocating effective wildlife to a more favorable habitat. And the third option is to establish a climate change corridor linking two or more wildlife areas to enable wildlife to migrate naturally between them. This is the option I tend to explore from a wildlife ownership perspective. So why is the concept of game ownership so important? Surely, if it occurs on my property, I own it. The answer is not necessarily so, as game ownership is a complex legal issue. But in simple terms, free-roaming game is considered res nullius. It therefore belongs to no one. It may be legally hunted or captured by anyone, and no security of ownership is granted until the animal is physically controlled. Then that person would be the legal owner of the animal. This common law status of game represented a threat to the game industry in South Africa, in that landowners did not own the assets they had invested in. At best, a person hunting or capturing an animal could be prosecuted for trespassing, but that person would legally retain his or her spoils. To remedy this problem, the Game Theft Act was promulgated to override this common law. In terms of this act, the Game Theft Act, however, was not written with climate change in mind, and hence it did not consider the relatively unknown common law provision of rewilding. The concept was a key consideration in the Medbury case in 2018, which, amongst other things, confirms its existence in our law. Rewilding is an exception to the escape clause, in that an escaped animal reverts to its res nullius status. Rewilding occurs when wildlife purposely escapes from being physically controlled to gain natural freedom. It therefore may be argued that climate change-induced escapes represent a form of rewilding. With the passage of time, however, rewilding is likely to become central to ownership of game disputes. Having established a firm grip on wildlife ownership and returning to the issue of climate change, I turn to the impact mitigation advice provided in the literature, which without surprise advocated adaptive management, for example, changing fire regimes, altering game densities and composition, and so on. Assisted migration, as I discussed earlier, and finally, my favorite, the establishment of migration corridors between two or more wildlife areas. Adaptive management and assisted migration is essentially the status quo, in that the animals remain physically controlled. in the introduction of wildlife or climate change corridors to allow natural migration is, however, a substantial change to the management of wildlife areas. Establishing a climate change corridor, at least in this country, is likely to go through poor rural communities as well as being unfenced. These communities are likely not to have had a history of peaceful coexistence with wildlife, and to the contrary, they are likely either to have experienced damage caused by wildlife or are aware of the problem. Hence, the corridor is likely to evoke additional issues that go well beyond climate change. Nonetheless, a wildlife corridor will require part of or all of the wildlife area's game fence to be removed in order for the wildlife to make use of this facility. In case you haven't guessed, the consequence of removing part of all the game fence is the immediate loss of ownership, in that the previous enclosed wildlife will revert to its res nullius status. Thus, game may be legally hunted, seized by anyone, as they are no longer owned by the landowner. As a result, the game that occur in both the wildlife area and the corridor are at a high risk of being lost from the system. Again, if you haven't guessed, loss of game means economic loss. Economic loss points to the corridor recommendation posed and endorsed by us scientists in the literature to mitigate the impacts of climate change on wildlife is valueless and is unviable and impractical. Closing, 4 conclusions may be gleaned from the study. The first is that generalized recommendations in the literature may not have universal value, in that they lack practical context. Researchers are therefore encouraged to consider at least a legal context to ensure relevancy of the research. Game ownership certainly needs to be revisited by legal gurus to address, at least, again, the threat of climate change to the wildlife industry. And finally, anticipatory research must be appropriately contextualized to drive law reform. This is paramount given the rapidly changing conservation environment as a result of global climate change. If any of you are interested in understanding more about wildlife ownership and climate change, I suggest you have a look at these publications, as well as spend some quality time with the 3 judgments mentioned below. They make for some interesting reading. With that, Chair, I bring my presentation to an end.